What have we done? Is it a crime to be me? Is it a crime to be you? What have you done? Why is she your enemy? Because she doesn't come from the same village with you. Why is he your enemy? Because he doesn't come from the same region with you. What has he done? What have I done? Basically, the song says, what have I done? What have we done? Is it because I'm not from your area? Is it because I'm different from you? What have we done? Well, there's nothing we've done. It's not this one. Oh, yeah. No, it's not that one. It's this one.
Which one?
This one.
No!
Yeah.
No,
You
so,
can
no, so,
see
okay,
it's
so
coming.
this.
It's the one
Who
he's
this?
on.
This?
Yeah. Forgive him.
You keep changing. You keep saying this one and that one and this one. Which one is it?
No, it's that one. Oh, yeah. That hit him.
Amazing.
Not Iki. Yeehaw. Not Iki. I'm going to tell you that what it means. Iki. Ha. Lendlela. Utongo twane. Some of them say, We are going to give you a national anthem which was used in maybe 4 or 5 countries around Southern Africa called Nkosi Sikelel.
God bless Africa.
God bless Africa. Nkosi Sikelel.
Okay. Anyway, this was the time for everybody to be part of the show. Do you want to be part of the show?
Yes.
Do you really want to be part of the show?
Yes.
We've only got 2 minutes, you know. Okay. Come on, people. I'll teach you just a few moves. Give us the rhythm. Okay, come people. Ready? Come on.
bits of information about the challenges of slavery and racism that we still face today. And so, without taking any more of Baroness Hugh's time, can I invite her to come and address us on the topic of how we are combating modern slavery in Greater Manchester. And I'm glad to say that her colleague Debbie Ario will also be speaking.
Well, good morning, everybody. I feel I have inevitably been something of a letdown after that exuberant morning that you've had, and all the colour and the sound and the excitement, incredible. So I hope it's not too much of a disappointment, but I cannot compete with that, although you all did really well with dancing. That was great. I'd just like to thank David Holgate and Dean for inviting me here and for hosting this event, and for you all being here, because I think it's a really important day. then collegiate church, this site, this spot, denounced slavery, and that was a watershed moment, really, that galvanised the anti-slavery campaign in Manchester, but also the abolitionist movement right across the UK. Sometimes that was at some peril to his own life. He was threatened many times, other people working with him, and it took more than 20 years more to secure the abolition of slavery in the UK, and almost 50 years to get to that position in the rest of the British colonies in 1833. And unfortunately, we still live with slavery, modern slavery, and human trafficking almost 250 years on, although we now recognise it for the criminal activity as it is. In Greater Manchester, Programme Challenger is the partnership approach to tackling serious and organised crime, including modern slavery and human trafficking. This involves a wide range of partners, because it's not just something the police can address, it requires other people from other professions across the public, private, voluntary and community sectors, and many of whom are with us today. Together, Challenger takes deliberately a very strong victim-centred approach to modern slavery, identifying and safeguarding potential victims, identifying and prosecuting perpetrators who very often are at the end of a long chain of organised international criminals trading in people for profit, and working together to try and grow our understanding of who is affected, how they're affected, so that we can better prevent and respond to this absolutely horrendous crime. As we come to the end of Black History Month, and with the event today focusing on racism too in the UK, I wanted just to speak to you about modern slavery and race in Greater Manchester and the ways in which Challenger is working in partnership to address these issues. And I'll start by highlighting the work of the BME Anti-Slavery Network, hosted by Africa, who've developed an action plan for UK anti-slavery and trafficking organisations focused on promoting racial equality, diversity and inclusion. And this action plan highlights the racial imbalance that exists between people like me, those who devise and deliver policy in this area, and those who are subject to that policy. So it highlights that division, and it provides direction and guidance to support those of us working in this area to change the status quo and to improve approaches to racial justice. And I recommend that all organisations working in this space review the plan that the FRUCA has put forward and consider their own practices and policies in the light of the FRUCA's recommendations, as we are doing in Challenger now. And I'll just outline some of the ways today that we're doing that. I spoke in this cathedral about 2 years ago at an event that was themed around the hidden voices of modern slavery. And I made reference to how important it was to build bridges into communities and to empower the people closest to those issues to be given to take a role in the prevention and support in raising the voices of victims. And since then, we've had the honour of working with NESTAC, that's the New Steps for African Community, to put that into practice. We started a project with them to work with women from communities that have been identified as the most prevalent in reports of domestic servitude, perpetrators of abuse. Through delivering those sessions about servitude, these women have begun to recognise and identify this in their own lives. What emerged was a consistent experience where their domestic abuse had shared some of the words of some of the women who were involved in that work. One of them said, "I have been tortured emotionally, sometimes physically, by my husband, who kept me captive in the house just after I arrived in the UK. Another woman shared her experiences. My auntie paid for my ticket and got me a visa to come here and stay with her. She said I would have a better life if I help her out and could get a job to help my family too. Instead, I spent nearly 5 years in her home, captive, telling me that I had to work for her first to reimburse the money she spent to bring me over. I became like a domestic for my own auntie and her teenage children, my cousins, treated me very badly. I could not get any help because auntie said if I stay outside for more than 5 minutes, I'll be arrested by the police and I'll go to prison. And there, it is even worse, as I have no immigration papers, I can stay in prison forever. I was afraid to ask people, even if they were nice to me, because I thought I would be arrested. I had no life. I still have no life since I left them, as no one seems to care. I've not talked about this to people until now. Who can help? Is this domestic servitude? Many things like this are seen as normal in my community. I wish I could share with you everything that these women eventually had the courage to say. These testimonies and the stories recounted by women involved in this project highlight 2 key areas for women in these situations, experiencing what is modern slavery. The first centres on the question, what is normal? What is expected and accepted? How do we work with communities to break down cultural barriers that exist in recognising when somebody is being exploited and encourage and support organisations to explore the experience of individuals and hear and understand them for what they are? And secondly, how do victims who find themselves in a situation where their nationality and immigration status are used as a tool of coercion ever escape their exploitation? Every woman described their immigration status as something that was being used in this way and that prevented them from seeking help. This work has had a direct and immediate impact on the development of Greater Manchester's gender-based violence strategy and is now explicitly highlighted as an area that Programme Challenger will seek to understand better and work with organisations to develop responses. We'll continue to work with Nesta to do this, and tomorrow my colleagues from Challenger will be part of a panel event hosted by Nesta to launch research they have undertaken with the University of Central Lancashire into the mental health needs of women who experience domestic servitude. We're also working with organisations and professionals, particularly in the field of domestic abuse, to raise their awareness of the findings of this work and develop the understanding of practitioners around what is domestic servitude, what is domestic abuse, and the connections very often between the two. While continuing to work with Nesta to support the development of peer mentors to enable community-based conversations in this way, we're also developing further partnerships with other organisations working in this general field, particularly with women who experience forced marriage and female genital mutilation, to explore whether there are any hidden experiences of modern slavery also amongst these women. I suspect there are. In May this year, we invested in and began a 3-year research and data partnership with Trilateral Research, a research organisation working with the University of Manchester. And this seeks to penetrate, to gather data beyond the official figures provided by the police when modern slavery is reported or suspected, and the data provided by the Home Office when a potential victim is referred to the National Referral Mechanism to access Greater Manchester, immigration enforcement are one of our key partners. And while the Home Office dictates their priorities and targets nationally, we have been able to develop working relationships locally that have brought in a victim-centred approach to modern slavery in their enforcement work and focus on safeguarding first. So following the work undertaken with NESTAC that I just talked about, where it was highlighted that fear around immigration status was one of the main barriers to women seeking help, we supported immigration enforcement officers to commence community drop-in sessions with NESTAC, providing a safe space for women to seek information and support. These are provided in a non-enforcement environment with enforcement officers in plain clothes, and their job is to give advice and to provide clarity and to help build relationships of trust with authority, breaking down the impact of this being used by perpetrators as a weapon really of abuse and exploitation and form of control. Challenger partnership. Challenger. Have I run out of time? So cut me off at the mic. I had nearly finished, but Debbie.
I've got a handheld mic. Can you raise this one to me? Thank you. I'm sorry, it's handheld. It's like the dog.
I thought it was the equivalent of a hook, you know, on the neck. So, just in concluding, the Challenger Partnership will continue to be a space where the needs of the victim are put first. Another example is that the Challenger hosts a modern slavery victim navigator, as we call it, that's actually provided by Justice and Care, one of the important voluntary organisations in this field, and paid for by funds from my officer. And the navigator role is to help coordinate all the interventions that a victim may need to try and resolve their situation and extricate them from exploitation. For example, in one case, they're assisting a victim of labour exploitation and domestic servitude, a Pakistani national who was being exploited and abused by her brother. The brother was also suspected of taking the victim's visa and passport. And through working with our partners in Immigration and Enforcement and Greater Manchester Police, the Justice and Care Navigator was able to establish and confirm the immigration status of the person and approach the Pakistan consulate to enable the victim to secure a new passport. And this addressed the issues that the victim was concerned about regarding her immigration status, and importantly, safeguarded her from further exploitation and removed the leverage that her brother had had over her. And we'll continue to work in partnership to identify and champion the voices of survivors, to support them effectively. We are on a journey. You know, this is all relatively new, but we're really committed to understanding all we can and to working as hard as ever to really safeguard and support victims and extricate them from these terrible, terrible situations. So I'd now like to introduce you to Debbie Ario, Chief Executive of Aruka, whom I mentioned, and Debbie's going to outline the key aims of the BMA Anti-Slavery Network and EDI, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Action Plan. So, Debbie.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Debbie. I run a charity called Africa Safeguarding Children. So it's possible that some of you may have heard of Africa. And because of the work we do at Africa, and we've been doing work around the trafficking of people from African countries for about 20 years, we realized that actually there is a dearth of BME-led organizations working in the anti-trafficking sector here in the UK. So when we go to policy meetings, most often than not, it's Africa sitting at the table. And so we realized that actually we needed to form a network of organizations in different communities with an interest in anti-trafficking so that we can come together as a unit to amplify our voices. And so in 2019, just before the lockdown, we set up the UK BME Anti-Slavery Network, BASNet. And it's the first network in the UK here, but also in Europe, dedicated to promoting racial equality, diversity, and inclusion in the anti-trafficking and anti-slavery space. Our network members are registered charities or community interest companies working in diaspora communities affected by modern slavery. So far, we have about 60 members. We have full members. So our full members are small grassroots organizations. And we have associate members who are academics, researchers, people who work in the statutory sector, and so on and so forth. BASNet recognizes the continuous gaps and failings within the UK modern slavery sector that promote racial injustices, leaving victims and survivors of trafficking exposed to a double jeopardy of abuse, exploitation, and harm. And this happens within the policy-making process. So I have to mention, because this is something that concerns us a lot as Africa, we see many victims of trafficking who have not only gone through horrendous experiences, but they're then doubly failed by the system here in the UK. And this is what we call the hostile policy of the present government. And we have to say it, which treats survivors and victims of trafficking from other countries primarily as illegal immigrants. So, they're seen first and foremost as illegal immigrants rather than people who require help and support. We see this in legislation, including the Nationality and Borders Bill, which specifically targets victims of trafficking from abroad and seeks to compound their life experiences in different ways. We also see this in the general failure to tackle child criminal exploitation. And child criminal exploitation is a problem in Manchester. We know because we have a project working on that specific issue here in Manchester. Child criminal exploitation is a form of modern slavery, and it disproportionately affects children in Black and minority ethnic communities. We also see this gap in the depth of research to address key issues in marginalized communities, or even in the lack of researchers from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds able to shape and produce well-informed research that speaks to the true lived experiences of affected communities. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that there is a huge plethora of failure, to involve affected communities in the fight against modern slavery, and also actually address issues that actually specifically affect victims from different BME communities themselves. So at BASNet, because of these concerns and other failings, we developed a sector-wide equality, diversity, and inclusion action plan, and we launched that in July this year. Our Race EDI action plan presents an opportunity for the UK modern slavery and human trafficking sector, indeed for all key players, to do an introspection and a review of approaches to victims, survivors, and other service users within the sector. And so the idea of the Race action plan is to drive institutional and structural changes through the recommendations that we made. So in the action plan, we identify key areas of research, policy, the role of the immigration sector, the role of the health sector, the role of the Home Office, and so on and so forth. And we identified key recommendations, things that they have to tackle to help effect changes. And we also developed indicators of progress to showcase when this has been done. But this will require, and we know that it will require resources to implement, it will require time, money, skills, and efforts. But I guess for us, the key issue is the political will on the part of government, national government, regional government, local government, to effect the policy changes. And of course, for the charities, our colleagues in the charity sector, to improve how they work with survivors, how they recruit staff, who they appoint to their board of trustees, their senior management, and so on and so forth. So we're coming from the viewpoint that our charities, i.e. charities working in anti-slavery, must be reflective of the people they serve. So most victims of trafficking are from BME communities. They're either from different countries or they're from UK BME communities. So our policies must be inclusive and must promote racial justice and equity. The UK modern slavery space must become more diverse. So currently it isn't. It has to become more diverse, more equal and more inclusive. And so we all have to play our key role to make this happen. So we produced this action plan to encourage the different arms of the sector to adopt a plan with a focus on change. So we want to actually see change happen. And we hope that actions by those with the responsibilities will be in line with the acknowledgement of their own obligation in meeting their public sector equality duty, as well as their commitment to achieving racial justice and equity in their organizations. So the Race EDI Action Plan can be downloaded if you would like to have a copy of it on our website, which is bmeantislavery.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes free for questions, and this was the roving mic I was going to take to you. So if anybody would like to respond to the information we've received or has a question, I'm able to. There's a clip-on mic and a roving mic. Thank you, Stephen. So Stephen has a roving mic. If anybody would like to just pop their hand up if they have a question or comment that they'd like to make. We've just got a few minutes, but it's always good to get responses. There's a question over there. Thank you. There's a question. He has a microphone.
Thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, and thank you for the presentation. A couple of days ago, I was sent a video of these three women, and I think it looks as though they're in London, and there was a problem about, it's an older woman who had her, immigration state visa. Something has been taken away from her, and these three women are on the streets of London. One is pregnant, and if you see the video, it is really, really quite distressing. Now, as an ordinary member of the public, obviously it wasn't given a great detail, and it's like, how, do you get help to these women who are being turfed out of their home? One in particular, the other two didn't speak, but she's had this visa taken away from her by the Home Office. She's not allowed to work, she's no money. The problems of caring for himself, and I think there's a refugee or a home who they can stay for 90 days, but they have to leave at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they're left on the street. They've been raped. Just the story is horrendous, and I think it's very shameful that we as a British society is allowing this to happen. There's women as women, we have other problems to deal with, menstrual problems, all of these things, plus one is pregnant. What do we do with how do we reach out and help these people? And the sad thing is, the video wasn't giving enough information. It was just saying, these three women need help. They've already been raped, and one also has diabetic mental health problems. They're traveling about on the train all day because, they can't, there is nowhere for them. And another thing, why are they being kicked out of a refuge at 8 o'clock in the morning? They're not due back till 6 o'clock at night. So, this isn't a compassionate, this isn't the society which any of us want to see. So what is it, and how do we reach you? I don't know how to reach these women, and I'm so grateful for what you're doing, because it was so distressing, the video. If you do, I think I still have it maybe on the phone that I can share.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very vivid statement, really, rather than a question. I'm aware that we're looking at the time, and we need to end this session at 12:30. Debbie, I don't know if you want to just make a closing remark, or if just in response to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm hoping, I'm praying that the person who actually made the video themselves actually acted to help safeguard those women. Because if they did it, if all they did was take the video and posted it online, that would be very shameful, I think. So let's hope that they've been found help and support, because the person who posted the video did something about that.
I think we can't engage in a two-way conversation. Thank you.
I can respond to you separately.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. And just, of course, a reminder that we have a number of organizations and stalls here, so there are other people who want to pick up this conversation, perhaps over lunch. But can I thank Baroness Hughes and Debbie for their presentations today, for taking the time to be with us, but more so for the work that you are doing to spearhead the modern challenges. Can we give them a big thank you? Nobi. Addie is an academic and also one of the canons on the chapter at Manchester Cathedral. She's also a leading Anglican participating in General Synod, and has been particularly participating in the recent report From Lament to Action, which was a call to the Church of England to stop wringing its hands about racism within its midst and start doing stuff. Addie is going to now present to us something of that process and where we are at this point. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Canon David, and thank you, Dean and Chapter and the organization, those that organized today. Well, as David said, I'm sort of one of those that was opportune to be asked to look into racism in the church. In June 2020, the Church of England House of Bishops agreed to set up an Archbishop's task force, which will lead to a commission. And on the 13th of October last year, the remit and its membership were announced. The task force had a specific reporting role, an analysis role, which reflected the background of its membership, which was 9 in number. Yes, I suppose I was appointed, amongst the 9 strong people, because my background, actually, my PhD background was in equality, diversity, inclusion, with special reference to higher education and to participation in higher echelon. So the remit of the task force was, 1, to review recommendations made in previous years by the Committee for Minority Ethnic Anglican Concerns, CMIAC, noting actions taken or omitted, and to identify which recommendations could be implemented quickly and swiftly. The second remit was to advise the archbishops on the composition and remit of the Racial Justice Commission, including the terms of reference. As the chair of the task force, Reverend Aurora said, for more than 30 years, the Church of England has been talking about racism, making recommendations and passing resolutions, despite church has an opportunity that it cannot afford to miss. We cannot just pay lip service to the issues of racism as we have done for so long. It is vital that we listen to all different voices out there and having listened, fulfill our mission as a church by taking appropriate action. During the Windrush debates at the General Synod in February last year, which focused on the racism experienced by the UK LE people in the Church of England since the arrival of the Windrush generation. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Justin Welby, said, "There was no doubt when we look at our own church that we are still deeply institutionally racist." His words, not mine. Let's just be clear about that, he said. I said it to the College of Bishops a couple of years ago, and it's true. Hence, the task force approach was not at a battle in a culture war, but rather to call to arms against the evil and pernicious sin of racism, flowing not from identity politics, but from our identity in Christ. And to address the institutional racism, we recognize that this was not a theological addendum, but a missional imperative of the Church of England, which was set out in the Anglican Fourth Mark of Mission to transform unjust structures of society. These 5 marks of mission were adopted by the Church of England General Synod in 1996, having been developed by the Anglican Consultation Council since 1984. So before we started, looking at the recommendations, we did some background research. And in our background research, 25 previous reports were identified, which had been presented to the General Synod of the Church of England in the past 36 years. 25 previous reports have been presented to the General Synod of Church of England in the past 36 years. The reports together identify 161 formal recommendations made to the church related to racial justice, and many more informal reports besides. Majority of these reports were produced by CMIAC and its predecessor, the Committee of Black Anglican Concern. Informed by the previous recommendation, the task force identified 5 priority areas of action based on themes which appear repeatedly in previous reports. So the 5 priority areas we identified were participation, which includes appointment, education, training and mentoring, young people, structure, and governance. In the report, there are detailed implementation actions for each of the priority areas. Take, for instance, I will talk about the participation first, which includes, as I said, appointments. For example, in terms of the most senior level of leadership in Church of England, this reveals an alarmingly retrograde trend. The former Bishop of Rochester, Bishop Michael Nazir Ali, was the church's first UKME diocesan bishop when he was appointed in 1994. After him, Dr. John Santamo was appointed Bishop of Birmingham in 2002, and then in 2005 was appointed Archbishop of York. There are 7 bishops from UK minority ethnic backgrounds currently in Church of England. But there are no diocesan bishops currently from UKME backgrounds, following the retirement last year of the former Archbishop of York, Dr. John Santamo. Fewer than 4% of the serving clergy identify as being from UKME background, according to the latest statistics. 1 in 10 of the people recommended last year for training for ordination ministry in the Church of England were from UKME backgrounds. 1 in 10. So how to change things? Future cohorts of strategic leadership development program to have at least 30% of UKME participation to build a pipeline supply for senior leadership in the church. 30% figure recognizes the urgency of current situation. Secondly, those responsible for senior appointments to undertake anti-racism training. Third, work with higher education institutions to actively and intentionally increase the number of UKME training for ordained ministry. And the 5th point is to ensure all recruitment panels are as diverse as possible. There are more to this, if you go to the Church of England website. I've just picked out, some of the ones I feel are very important. The next priority area is education. Education was taken in its broadest context. Therefore, the recommendations cover schools, academies, and theological education institutions. The content and curriculum development to speak to the concern of racial justice. And the teachers there to be equipped appropriately for the work. We also recommend that to make governing bodies or boards, teaching staff, student population more inclusive. Because if you look at most of the governing bodies of Church of England schools, you'll see that they are not at all inclusive. It's not diverse, not to talk about inclusion. Training program. 1, unconscious bias. 2, intracultural awareness. And 3, to promote and embed racial diversity for all national ministries, team staff, including back advisors. This can build on or make use of the existing resources we have here in Manchester, Leicester, or Birmingham. The 4th priority area is about the young people. And the second one comes from Bonhoeffers, who claimed that church cannot be a church if it does not care for a child and does not see the child at the heart of the congregation. So partnering the churches that have a majority UKME members and sharing resources and knowledge to make youth groups more inclusive. That's another recommendation. And also to review schools and youth groups, racial justice resources used in dioceses and commission new ones as necessary. The third one is to celebrate diversity from a faith perspective. Then the last priority area we looked at was the structures and governance. The task force wants to see change, support, and resources mobilized so that every part of the church becomes a positive and life-giving place for all people. And once institutional racism is identified, the imperative is to act decisively and boldly within the organization to eradicate it. To this, we recommended that racial justice directorates should be created and appoint full-time racial justice officers in every diocese for a fixed 5-year term. So time to act is now, we reckon. Any failure by the wider church to act could be a last straw for many people of UK minority ethnic and global majority heritage backgrounds, according to the Archbishop's Anti-Racism Task Force. The report set out 47 specific recommendations from different arms of the church to implement, ranging from shortlisting for staff roles and senior clergy, including bishops and archbishops, to the content of teaching in theological colleges. The nine-strong group, as I said before, that was set up in autumn last year, carried out a rapid review of dozens of previous reports and studies dating back 36 years and drew out proposals which could be enacted quickly. Its other role was to prepare, as I said, the ground for the establishment of a longer-term commission on racial justice to look at questions ranging from legacy of statues, monuments relating to slavery, to how everyday culture of parish life could be acting as a barrier to inclusion. In our work as a task force, we have considered more than 20 reports. Since then, 20 reports from the mid-80s, as I said earlier, and since then, the Church of England has considered motion after motion, debate after debate, yet we still find ourselves in the position where throughout life as a church, the flourishing of UKME Anglican is hard to discern. Decades of inaction carries consequences, and this inaction must be owned by the whole church. A failure to act now will be seen as another indication, potentially a last straw for many, that the church is not serious about racial sin. The group explained, we share together the understanding that racism is a sin. Racial sin disfigures God's image in each of us. Racial sin dehumanizes people by taking away their fundamental God-given human dignity. Wherever racial sin flourishes systematically, either in society or in our church, we must challenge it together. We must repent of racial sin, turn away from racism, and be reconciled so that we may all experience the love of God. The report accepts the definition of institutional racism adopted by McPherson's report into the mother of Stephen Lawrence, covering processes, attitudes, and behavior, which all amount to discrimination as applying to the Church of England, and speaks of racism as a sin requiring repentance. The report examines the underrepresentation of UKME people in the leadership of the church, with currently only 3.8 of paid clergy identifying as being from minority ethnic background, and only 13 senior clergy, including just 5 are bishops. Disregarding a significant part of the population and thus denying the gifts they bring for the service of the church must not continue. The task force warns and adds that addressing systems and institutional racism and racial sin in the church is not a theological addendum, as I said. It is a missional imperative of the Church of England. Among the recommendations are a general expectation that short lists for jobs in the church will include at least one appointable UKME candidate. For more senior roles, right up to bishops, the report sets out specific requirements to ensure this happens. It also sets out new approaches for shortlisting and interviewing, which places a duty on the employer to improve participation on an action or explain basis, rather than relying on bland encouragements for underrepresented groups to apply. The report recommends requiring recruitment bodies, including the Crown Nomination Commission, CNC, which nominates the assistant bishops, to provide valid, publishable reasons for failure to include UKME candidates on shortlists. The report also calls for the General Synod to co-opt 10 UKME candidates, 5 clergy and 5 laity, for its next 5 term, which begins this year, in fact, next month. And for the House of Bishops to invite UKME clergy from each region to become participant observers until there are at least 6 UKME bishops in their house. The Strategic Leadership Development Program, a scheme to support clergy identified as having potential for taking on significantly wider responsibilities in future, should ensure 30% of new intakes should come from UKMA backgrounds. It recommends. That figure is twice the estimated proportion of those that worship in the Church of England. In order to begin to tackle the current imbalance in the church's leadership by building potential supply for leadership, senior leadership in the church. I've mentioned this before, that the bishop should undergo reverse mentoring by UKMA clergy and lay. It also calls for every diocese to have a full-time racial justice officers funded centrally, and for National Church to set up a new racial justice directorate to oversee the work. The report sets out a proposed program of work for the new Racial Justice Commission, covering a broad range of areas, including how complaints of discrimination and racism could be handled in the future, and how churches should respond to historical monuments and buildings of contested heritage, such as links to slavery. Well, deciding what to do with the contested heritage is not easy. But we said, while history should not be hidden, we also do not want to celebrate or commemorate people who contributed to or benefited from the tragedy that was the slave trade. Rather than attempting to erase the past or rewrite history, the report calls for a healthy revision of memory and history in a way that will provide scope for education and formation. It also recommends that the new commission should examine broad questions of how parish life itself could become more inclusive. One of the barriers to inclusion or continued participation in the Church of England for those from UKMA and other backgrounds has been the challenge of cultural assimilation into the church, where there is perceived to be little or no room for cultural expression outside of the dominant culture, which is predominantly white and middle class. Outside the Church of England, the UKMA communities have enriched and influenced culture in a way that has not been sorry about that, that has not been apparent in the church, where there seems to be little, if not room for cultural development or enrichment due to hierarchical structure where UKMA people are absent. So to conclude, during the last General Synod in July, a lay representative asked what progress had been made since to release funding for the appointment of racial justice officers in the diocese. The reply from Archbishop of York was, the Archbishop's Council has concluded that it cannot support this recommendation in this formulation at this time, given the need to reduce costs in diocesan and national administration. So as members of the task force, we are deeply shocked and are disappointed, but remain hopeful that the council, together with the church commissioners and the House of Bishops, will reconsider that decision. If they cannot afford to appoint racial justice officers now, when will be the question. I've been asked to finish up. So, addressing systemic and institutional racism in the Church of England is not, I still repeat, a theological addendum. It is a missional imperative for the Church of England. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
It's not recording, but click camera, so left feeling boy. That's fine. So, compare with my belly sinisi. To my say, I can be see it become. Can you still hear me now? Can you still hear me now? Can you still hear me now? Okay, that's it. Okay, that's fine. That's it. Let me see. Can you still hear us? Sometimes technical stuff makes you go mad. Nothing we did.
to bring your good selves into the main arena of the nave. And I'm so glad you've quietened down. That's so good. Please come along. We have the Methodists here too. We very warmly welcome Methodists in this Anglican cathedral. Jay, huh? Lots. Some of you are hovering on the side. Let's be encourage you to come into the middle. Come along. If you enjoyed the lunch, which I'm sure you have, those of you who partook, there's a little advert. Rita Obi was the cook. And you can, let's give it a hand clap firstly to say thank you. Thank you, Rita and company, for the lovely food. And if you'd like Rita's details for you to order your next party food, Nidhi's got it. We want to begin our afternoon session now, so welcome everybody, those of you who just joined us, and thank you to the rest of us for hanging around during the day for this afternoon session. Excuse me. And we've been involved in our annual Challenging Hate Race, Hate Crime Awareness Week with the City Council. And so this afternoon's program is kind of part of that work that we engage in, that interfaith work that we engage in twice a year here at the cathedral. So it's very much a cathedral as well as a Challenging Hate collaboration this afternoon. So Challenging Hate have paid for your lunch this afternoon, thanks to the City Council. I want to just say welcome firstly. My name is Rogers Governor, I'm the Dean here. So welcome to all of you. It's really good to have you in the cathedral for this event. Today, this race, Challenging Hate event is part of a broader, bigger vision for the cathedral's Clarkson Day. My colleague Canon David Holgate's the chief organizer of this Thomas Clarkson Day. So I want to thank David for all the hard work that he's put into this event. We've had sort of lovely speeches this morning informing us of what we're doing about modern slavery and so on. Thomas Clarkson, as you will hear just now, I'm sure is very much about slavery, or rather anti-slavery. Over 200 years, Clarkson spoke in the cathedral and against slavery, and you'll hear all about that in a short while, and I don't want to get into that too much. Let me just repeat what I said at Chester Cathedral 2 weeks ago, when I was invited to preach on anti-slavery. Excuse me, I said that you invited me here to speak about slavery and anti-slavery. However, keep in mind I was preaching to an all-white congregation. I said, however, you must remember that when anybody speaks about slavery, we cannot forget about slavery's twin sister, racism. Because it is slavery, we know that racism and slavery have been around for a long time, but we also know, that slavery sort of gave even more permission, if you like, for people to be exploited, for black people to be exploited, abused, and basically treated like, I don't have to tell you, the worst words I can sort of muster. Black lives became expendable, largely fueled, encouraged by slavery. So it was quite a tough sort of thing to say in an all-white congregation virtually, but it had to be said. Now some of you, how many of you are cricket lovers here? Cricket lovers? Have you heard the name Quinton de Kock? Yeah, you heard of him in the last few days. Well, Quinton de Kock is a South African cricketer. I'm South African, by the way. And he very recently, a few days ago, apparently refused to take the knee with the rest of the team. I'm not sure who South Africa was playing. Was it, anybody know? West Indies. So Quinton de Kock, a white member of the South African cricket team, refused to take the knee with the rest of the team. And you can imagine how the rest of the country are feeling about that. The kind of message that Quinton symbolically, representatively gives to the rest of the nation and the world, that racism, which is what taking the knee is all about, it's protesting against racism and making that visible in our witness, is not for white people in South Africa. Now you know why we cannot stop talking about racism. Because racism, we might think, even in a place like South Africa, and given all that Mandela has achieved in that country, is well over. Well, actually it isn't. So when we think about Clarkson, slavery, modern slavery, let's not forget that all of that leads up to racism, discrimination, exclusion of every sort. And we in this cathedral, we stand for inclusion of every sort. So that's why my opening sort of comments to us as we gather. Who was it that Tutu said, we've got to look after people, take care of people who are drowning, but we've got to go upstream and see why they're falling into the river in the first place. So we're going to be reflecting on some of that, I'm sure, in our afternoon together. With all of those comments, let me say welcome. And we've got some exciting, I should say entertainment, but it's more serious than entertainment. Our friend Nithya is here, and she's going to be performing some dance for us. You want to say something about the dance, Mom?
Namaste. Thank you very much, Reverend Dean. And I should say a big thank you to Dr. Holgate for inviting me to do this, and my very special friend Nidhi. My name is Nritya Rammohan, and I'm a dance practitioner. I do Indian classical dance. The type of dance I do is called Bharatanatyam. That comes from the southern part of India. Says bhava, expressions, raga, music, and thala for the rhythm. More about the pieces I've actually chosen today. The first one I'm going to do, the verses are actually from ancient Sanskrit texts. It's called the Argala Stotram, but more importantly talks about good over evil. I'm okay for this. Yeah, I'm okay for this. So when this topic was given to me, I felt we Hindus celebrated a very special time. It's called the Navratri. We talk about how the goddess takes a big form and destroys the Mahishasuram, who was a demon king. But I see that as racism and hatred. As you know, we've got to rise above everything else and show the courage and the bravery and the strength and fortitude and just believe in who we are. So that's the first piece I've chosen. The flip side of it, the second one I've actually chosen is called the Shanti Mantra. It says, let there be peace everywhere, let there be prosperity everywhere, let everybody be happy, let everybody be in peace. It's called Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha. So I think both have to work hand in hand. We've got to have the courage, but at the same time, I think peaceful coexistence works. So I'll give a little bit about the second piece in a minute. The first one, Argala Stotram.
मधुकैटव विध्वंसी विधात्री वरदे नमः रूपं देहि जयं देहि यशो देहि दिशो जहि महिषासुरनिर्णाशि भक्तानां सुखदे नमः रूपं देहि जयं देहि यशो देहि यशोदेहि दिशो जहि रक्तबीज वधे देवी चण्डमुण्ड विनाशिनी रूपं देहि जयं देहि यशो देहि दिशो जहि निशुम्भ शुम्भ निर्णाशि त्रैलोक्य शुभदे नमः रूपं देहि जयं देहि यशो देहि दिशो जहि वन्दितां युगे देवी सर्वसौभाग्यदायिनी रूपं देहि जयं देहि यशो देहि दिशो जहि
गिरिनन्दिनि नन्दितमेदिनि विश्वविनोदिनि नन्दनुते गिरिवरविन्द्यशिरोदिनि वासिनि विष्णुविलासिनि जिष्णुनुते भगवति हेशिति कण्ठकुटुम्बिनि भूरि कुटुम्बिनि भूरि कृते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते सुरवरवर्षिणि दुर्धरधर्षिणि दुर्मुखमर्षिणि हर्षरते त्रिभुवनपोषिणि शङ्करतोषिणि कल्मषमोषिणि घोषरते तनुजनिरोषिणि दितिसुतरोषिणि दुर्मदशोषिणि सिन्धुसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते
I'm quite loud. Is that okay if I talk this way? I can use my hands. I can hold it. Maybe you can hold. As you may see, lots of hands and faces and legs going on. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of context of what I'm going to do for the second one.
William, just hold on a minute. One more. Okay.
So this is the Shanti mantra. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhaved. Let there be peace everywhere. Let there be prosperity everywhere. Let there be happiness everywhere. So just as all the elements and all the creatures all around us thrive hand in hand, I think we should, as men and women, and we should also try and be united in what we do. That's what I've done. So we talk about the moon, the sun, the moon behind her, the earth, the sky, wind, water, and we talk about all the creatures, all the birds, and all the creatures all living together, and men, women, children, and all of us to be united, and no war, between us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nirtha. There you are. She will be leading us later this afternoon in a Bollywood presentation, and hoping that we will also get our mojos out, or whatever we do, as we thank you. It's so inspiring to see the human body moving in such a disciplined and beautiful way. So thank you for sharing that taster of Indian classical dance with us as a way, on the theme of peace, as we hearing Shanti, 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 leading us into the discussion this afternoon. The handheld mics are here because we're wanting to have some breakout groups, as you can see. Well, you can't see, but they were in the program after the keynote address, and the roving mics will be here just so we can pick up observations and thoughts as part of our response to the keynote address. I'm going to change microphones. I'm looking for our keynote speaker, Dr. Andy Boaki. Andy is, as you'll see on the program, a lecturer in the Department of Religions and Theology at the University of Manchester. Andy is a New Testament studies specialist, but like many theologians today, teaches much more widely across the curriculum. If I remember correctly, Andy has also been involved in the research process that Addy was sharing before lunch. Have I got that right or wrong, Andy? I may have got that wrong. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Boaki to us this afternoon, and to invite him to give our keynote lecture on this very first Clarkson Day, bearing in mind the interfaith nature of this afternoon, on the role of faith communities in tackling racism in Greater Manchester and in the UK. So Andy, would you kindly come forward, please, and we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Canon Holgate, and thank you as well to the organising committee for putting this marvellous event on. What Canon Holgate didn't tell you was that I was originally scheduled to do the Indian classical dancing today, but we thought we'd leave it to someone else at the last minute. So we're speaking about the role of faith communities in tackling racism in the UK and Greater Manchester. And this is a discussion which I hope will continue beyond today, but of course, as we memorialise the incredible work of Thomas Clarkson, it is particularly important that we think about these things today. Christians who've been involved in raising ecological awareness have long noticed something critically important in their own struggle. And I quote here from John Grimm and Mary Evelyn Tucker, who acutely noted the following: "What is becoming more self-evident is that the ecological crisis cannot be solved by science, technology, law, politics, or economics alone. Because we are more aware that environmental and development issues are in large measure social issues. Thus, fixing the environment through technology or regulating development through legislation will not be sufficient." This is where both Grimm and Tucker see religion coming in, because religion highlights, quote, "those cosmological stories, symbol systems, as we just saw through the dance, ritual practices, ethical norms, historical processes, and institutional structures that transmit a view of the human as embedded in a world of meaning and responsibility, transformation, and celebration." It's this very idea that I believe Thomas Clarkson saw so deliberately, so passionately, and so unremittingly. Having been threatened by pro-slavery supporters on the docks in Liverpool, he came and he preached in Manchester's Collegiate Church in 1787, which of course later became the cathedral. Clarkson recalled the experience of delivering that sermon in his work the history of the rise, progress, and accomplishment of the abolition of the African slave trade by the British Parliament in 1808, where he wrote the following: "When I went into the church, it was so full that I could scarcely get to my place, for notice had been publicly given, though I knew nothing of it, that such a discourse would be delivered. I was surprised also to find a great crowd of black people standing around the pulpit. There might have been 40 or 50 of them. The text that I took as the best to be found in such a hurry was the following: Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing that you were strangers in the land of Egypt." He's quoting there from Exodus 22, verse 21. Clarkson argued that slavery violated the most fundamental Christian and human principles, and that forcibly removing human beings from their homes, transporting them to foreign countries, and to make them the possessions of other people was simply morally unjustifiable. He continued saying the following words in his sermon. If we could have the next slide, please. These are the words of Clarkson's sermon. "If then we oppress the stranger, as I have shown, and if by a knowledge of his heart we find that he is a person of the same passions and feelings as ourselves, we are certainly breaking, by means of the prosecution of the slave trade, that fundamental principle of Christianity, which says that we shall not do that unto another which we wish should not be done unto ourselves. And I fear cutting ourselves off from all expectation of the divine blessing. For how inconsistent is our conduct? We come into the temple of God, we fall prostrate before him, we pray to him that he will have mercy on us. But how shall he have mercy on us, who have had no mercy upon others? We pray to him again that he will deliver us from evil. But how shall he deliver us from evil, who are daily invading the right of the injured African and heaping misery on his head? Now, even as I read these words, I wonder how so clear a truth could have been so obscure to so many, even people within the church. And if today, as faith communities, we are to meaningfully combat racial hatred, prejudice, and injustice in our country, then we ought to emulate that spirit of Thomas Clarkson, which is, in my view, the spirit of the early Jesus movement and indeed of Jesus himself. I want to suggest today that the most powerful impact that faith communities can exert on a society is through their example. We're ashamed when people of faith engage in behaviors that demean religious belief. So we should, by the same token, rejoice when our witness reflects divine love into the darkest parts of the human experience. And so I want to share one story from the early church's life, adapted from a reading by a theologian and cultural critic called Dominique Dubois-Gilliard, which demonstrates how even the ancient Jesus movement had to navigate the thorny terrain of ethnic division, and how, with the same urgency of purpose that we see in Thomas Clarkson, the early church addressed the issues and testified to the unbelieving world. If we could have the next slide, please. Luke records this story in Acts chapter 6. Now, at this time, as the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint developed on the part of the Hellenistic Jews, that is, Greek-speaking Jews, against the Hebraic Jews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. So the 12 summoned the congregation of the disciples and said, "It is not desirable for us to neglect the word of God in order to serve tables, whom we may put in charge of this task. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." The announcement found approval with the whole congregation, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, and Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. And they brought these men before the apostles, and after praying, they laid their hands on them. The word of God kept spreading, and the number of the disciples continued to increase greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of priests were becoming obedient to the faith. You know, God's people have always been called to the sacrificial love of neighbor. As in Luke's parable involving a kind Samaritan, which showed that the definition of neighbor ought to be expansive and not restrictive. This love should be keenly extended to the most vulnerable and those on the margins of the community. Well, here in Acts chapter 6, we see the disciples demonstrate this very love by instituting a resource distribution program for widows, a very vulnerable cross-section of ancient society. But a problem arises. The widows from two different cultural backgrounds have a very different experience of the program. As Gilead argues, the Hebraic widows were insiders to the church's dominant Jewish culture, customs, and languages, whilst the Hellenistic widows, the Greek-speaking widows, were Jews who probably lived most of their lives in Greek-speaking cities and towns outside Jerusalem, and who returned to the city as cultural outsiders. And as such, these Greek-speaking widows felt as if their outsider status was causing them to be overlooked and marginalized in the church's distribution of provisions. The Hebraic widows had advocates at the table of power, i.e. the Hebraic leaders of the Jerusalem church, as well as cultural and linguistic and relational advantages. And so they were privileged as though they were superior. The Greek-speaking widows had neither real representation at the table or in the decision-making process, and they had no advocate to recognize their plight and were thus not cared for with the same love and tenderness as their Hebrew-speaking sisters. Now, as the text implies, it seems that this oversight was probably unintentional. My own guess is that these Greek-speaking widows were women who became members of the Jesus movement during the Pentecost. But again, to cite Gilead, once the complaint was raised, the disciples assessed the institutional structure and program. They didn't respond with defensiveness, denial of the problem, or any attempts to cover it up. They assessed the widows' benevolence program, determined that the discrimination claim was a legitimate one, and they established an early church council to oversee the matter. They elected 7 men filled with the Spirit, all of whom were Hellenists, I think that's interesting, to oversee resolving the problem. And the result, as Luke writes in Acts 6 verse 7, the word of God spread. The church confronted this issue of privilege and discrimination, and outsiders were attracted to the ancient Jesus communities. So I ask then, what can modern faith communities learn? If the church and other faith communities are going to confront inequality and racism in our cities and ultimately in our world, the very first thing we must do is recover the radical egalitarian love that Jesus impressed upon those earliest believers. Privilege, status, and hierarchy were woven into the fabric of imperial life, but the cross was the great leveler. It was the great equalizer of persons. If the incarnate God was executed in a fashion reserved for peasant rebels, then there is no room for big social distinctions in our churches or other faith communities. Our starting point must be that supremacy and domination are anti-truth, anti-peace, and anti-love. Racism flourishes where privilege is tolerated. Remember, it was so-called Christian slaveholders who taught that God had cursed the descendants of Ham, that is, all dark-skinned peoples, to be eternally subservient. And that's based on a very warped and confused reading of Genesis 9:25. And to continue to privilege white skin today is to buy into that falsehood. And it's not just false morally, if I can put my sort of biblical scholar's hat on for a second, it's false historically and hermeneutically as well. I won't bore you with those details. But with this as a point of departure, I suggest that faith communities can learn 3 things. If we have the final slide, please. And these are the 3 things that I want us to think through. I may be blocking that for some people. We must firstly model honest self-critique. Secondly, we must resist the temptation to depoliticize the gospel. And thirdly, we must recapture radical love. Firstly, then, modeling honest self-critique. The believers that Luke recalls in Acts 6 realized that dominance and privilege had taken hold, and they hit it head on. And remember, it was the 12, Jesus' own inner circle, those that he had handpicked himself, who stopped and said, we cannot allow the Hebrew-speaking widows to be privileged over the Greek-speaking widows. They witnessed Jesus' ministry themselves. They saw Jesus bring a zealot and a tax collector together. They saw him draw no status distinction between prostitutes, foreigners, and lepers on one hand, and the religious elite on the other, and they honestly appraised this widow's program. Their humble, honest, non-defensive self-critique is what led ultimately to justice in the community. But of course, this has not always been the response of the church. In his Life of an American Slave, Frederick Douglass bemoaned the religion of an American church that chose hypocritical comfort and conformity over honest self-critique and radical gospel love, when he wrote the following: between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity, end quote. The question for us as communities of faith is whether we will be honest in the appraisal of our own religious and spiritual spaces, owning up to our own deficiencies when voices from the margins cry out for justice. Will we be courageous enough to call out and correct privilege and dominance when it rears its head? As believing people, we cannot demand that society remove the speck from its eye when we have enormous hypocritical planks of wood in our own. Once we seize the initiative to engage theologically with questions of race, listen with patience and sensitivity to the stories of black and minority ethnic members of our communities, and become known for our intolerance of dominance, then we will be the light of the world and the salt of the earth, and our example will be one that is worthy of imitation. And yet this leads smoothly into this second idea. We must resist the temptation to depoliticize the gospel. Every so often, and most recently with the re-emergence of Black Lives Matter rhetoric that we heard last year, I hear Christians saying things like this: keep politics out of the gospel. Our job is to save souls and not to engage in social justice. I even heard one person recently say to me that Jesus was not a politician. Now, I get it. Well-intentioned Christians don't want other Christians squabbling over their political affiliations. That all makes sense. However, that's very different from pretending as if discipleship to Christ and the pursuit of social justice ever was and ever could be mutually exclusive. Luke is very specific about the problem that faced the Jerusalem community in Acts chapter 6. It was the privileging of Hebraic widows over the Greek-speaking widows. Equivalent problems existed when Paul took the gospel to the non-Jewish world. The difficulties he faced in trying to unite Christian Jews with Christian Gentiles were not spiritual problems, as if these were in some way divorced from political and ethno-religious realities, and it's simply dishonest to conclude otherwise. No sane reading of the New Testament Gospels could conclude that Jesus was somehow insensitive to social justice. When churches show active and vocal solidarity with anti-racist social movements and promote interfaith unity in furtherance of anti-racist initiatives, far from betraying or compromising the gospel, they are putting the gospel into correct practice, celebrating it, and showing that indeed their lives are informed by it. Remember, it was the 12, those 12 people who walked with the Messiah himself, who recognized the importance of rectifying ethnic privilege within the community. And thank goodness that their understanding of Jesus and his mission was not detached from social realities. And if we as people are to have a hope of tackling racism in our own communities as people of faith, then ours cannot be either. Thirdly and finally, we must embrace radical love. Imperial society was very highly class conscious, and though there was mobility between the classes, people generally knew their place in ancient Roman society. You had patricians, senators, and equestrians who formed a kind of aristocratic class, and then the closest thing to a middle class perhaps were the commons, and then you had the peasantry, slaves, and freed people at the lowest rung of the social ladder. And then into this world came this odd Jewish sect, the Jesus movement, that cared for widows and embraced peasants and the nobility in the same way. This was a group who, ironically, given the present circumstances, were known for staying in the city when pandemics broke out, like the plague of Cyprian, which the Christian Cyprian wrote about, which is why it's called the plague of Cyprian, when upwards of 5,000 people were dying in the city of Rome every day. The pagan emperor Julian wrote to his high priest in Galatia about this weird sect of people that followed this crucified Jew, and about how they stayed in the city during the outbreak of this ancient pandemic, not only helping their own sick, but helping all the sick. This radical gospel love was inexplicable to Roman sensibilities. When Paul wrote to his colleague and convert Philemon to welcome the renegade slave Onesimus back as a brother, this signaled a total reconfiguration of the imperial status quo. Slave and slave master living as brothers. Try to imagine that even in the days of the transatlantic slave trade. Slave master and slave living together and treating one another as equal and as family. Tom Wright concluded that if Philemon were the only New Testament document to ever have existed, that we would still have to conclude that something fairly remarkable had happened in the first third of the first century of the Common Era. And it's precisely this kind of countercultural, status quo disturbing, Christ-centered, radical love that challenges and changes the social landscape. There are racially divided communities in the UK, and certainly in the northwest of England. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples must be those spaces in our urban and rural settings which buck the trend of racial division and demonstrate how difference and diversity is cause for celebration and for championing understanding. Speaking as a Christian, however divided a community might be along racial, ethnic, or class lines, the church has to be the place where the walls come down and radical love is expressed. Before Paul introduced his famous love poem in 1 Corinthians 13, he wrote, "And I will now show you the most excellent way." When the church sticks its neck out to become the platform of dialogue between divided communities, it shows that most excellent way, the way of human sisterhood and brotherhood and of radical love. When I heard relatively recently of a black man being turned down for a curacy post in the Church of England because the demographic of the parish was, quote, white working class, part of my frustration was in how the church chose the comfort of the status quo over the social discomfort of radical love. Just as the 12 chose not to opt for the comfort of ignoring the cries of those Greek-speaking widows, and Jesus chose not to ignore the cries of the prostitute, the leper, the tax collector, and the foreigner, the church must stop seeking comfort and embrace radical love, even in the most racially uncertain contexts. Now, as a Christian and as a human being, I want a comfortable life, don't we all? But what on earth would the church be if Jesus' mission were to seek comfort? If Martin Luther King and Desmond Tutu chose comfort over radical love, just think how radically and deeply impoverished our world would be. In conclusion, though William Wilberforce usually gets the credit, Thomas Clarkson lobbied for the abolition of slavery for almost 50 years alongside Wilberforce. The great romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge described Clarkson as the moral steam engine of abolitionism. Clarkson was someone who was unafraid to critique the church of his day, honestly and humbly. He was someone who refused to divorce the gospel from social justice, and he was clearly someone who embraced the most radical gospel love. Today, as we reflect on his legacy and remember his contribution to the struggle, I want us also to reflect on his discipleship, a discipleship of courageous resistance. And as we talk over these ideas in groups, I want us to carefully consider how we might internalize the spirit of this great prophet. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. You've set the agenda for the next little period of our afternoon. We've got just over an hour set aside till 4 o'clock is our cutoff point this afternoon. And we're wanting to arrive at a point when we can make an active commitment about our response to the need for justice, equality, and inclusion for all. So we need to travel from where we are to that point. And we'd like to invite you, there's no compulsion, if you want to take a little walk or a little breather, Neithia will be dancing again at 3:15. But if you'd like to, we invite you to just chat to your neighbor or move the chairs around. They're not pushed together too closely, and have a conversation with somebody else, somebody you don't know perhaps, on one or more of these three challenges, because I think the simplicity of Andy's presentation belies the depth of the challenge. And so I invite us, thinking about our own faith communities or hearing about another faith community that's not familiar to us, let us reflect on these. The question is, in what way does my faith community model honest self-critique? In what way does your faith community resist the temptation to depoliticize? Now, the gospel is Christian language, but depoliticize, let us say, what Thomas Clarkson used in his sermon. I wouldn't want to do to others what I wouldn't want them to do to me, the negative version of the golden rule. And then thirdly, of course, the heart of the Torah and the gospel and other faiths, and that is radical love for the other. So will you do so? And I've got a roving microphone under my chair, and I'll call us back together probably in about 15 minutes or so, and then we can hear what your thoughts are on one or other of these questions.
Yeah, because
who clearly won't be able to summarize everything, but just a flavor. So, Stephen, I think just nobble this first group and then we'll go round.
Oh, thank you, Roger, for nominating me. Our discussion was about privilege and very much about gender as well. Because if you look at faith organizations, historically, all the apostles, disciples were all male. Certainly in my faith, it's very much a gender issue. And that gender gives the men the power to control and actually keep the females down. And I think the thing is that if women were brought forward, they would be much, much more. Certainly I've experienced it with myself when they lead the prayers, when they do things, they do it in a way where they're very encouraging, I was going to use the word passionate, well not passionate, very softly and gently and take everybody with them. Whereas men always, well I certainly feel like if I always have the power, and I shouldn't, I need to change myself first of all really.
very sexist. Anyone else want to say something? Yeah, exactly. There is an element of that, isn't there? He says, still holding the microphone. I think one of the key issues we were looking at was about challenge. And when we identify racism, when we identify practices that are not welcoming and not enabling, to try and find ways of challenge. Not confrontational, but to try and make it in terms of a way that's, use the position we may have, or just the opportunity to say something, to make a suggestion, even to say, I don't feel comfortable with that, or I don't like that. Just try and find a way forward to bring people with us, sort of thing, as sort of we were saying there. But, and there are a few different ideas, but that's about it.
Okay. Oh, do I have to stand up? For me, when I've done some of this work in the past as a youth worker, doing anti-racist training with other white people, for me it's about having those allies who from the white community, but also giving space to have these conversations and doing it in quite a structured way, but in ways that allow people, white people who are coming out with the racist stuff, to be honest about what they're really thinking, but then to have space to converse and understand that actually a lot of that might be based in ignorance, it might be based in habit, it might be based on things like, my dad believes that, so that's what I believe. I grew up here doing this, so that's what I do. And what we found when I was doing that work, gosh, it was a while ago, but that actually there are very good, constructive ways that you can challenge it without people feeling put down or feeling belittled, and that they actually move into some other understanding, and that's the change we want to see, isn't it? When people suddenly start thinking, oh, I was wrong, that isn't right, what I believe. So that was my thought. Thank you.
Thank you. The next group.
Can I address Andy's work on scripture there, on Acts chapter 6? You rightly used that as an example. Sorry? Stand up. Use that as an example. But it seems to me the whole thing actually is about empowerment and leadership, because Acts 6 then moves into the rest of Acts. Luke gives 2 whole chapters to Stephen, who is one of those 7, and he becomes martyred. Then we read about Philip, another one of those people who's not serving cups of tea or doing the food bank. He's actually baptizing Ethiopian eunuchs. And then later on we discover that he's miles and miles away from Jerusalem, and he's got 7 daughters who prophesy, hence also the gender thing. Seems to me that a key part of what Luke is saying in that passage actually is the shift is empowerment and leadership from the 12 to a new generation, and they're actually the ones who are showing the way forward. So maybe actually the empowerment for leadership is actually one which actually benefits the whole.
Thank you. That's really helpful and connects with Andy's presentation before lunch. The next group. The reluctant reporter there. Sister, we look forward to hearing your report.
My group looked at model honest self-critique and recapturing that radical love.
Could you just speak a little louder so we can hear? Thanks.
Okay. And what we were discussing is that if we are honest with ourselves first, then as a church, as a collective, then we are able to move on and really get a grip in terms of racism. So I gave an example and I said, I always look inward before I can look outward. So I just said to them that early this week we were at a civic event and there were 7 or so black persons at my table and 1 individual was white. And as I was listening to the speakers, I saw this gentleman that sat behind me. I believe that he was uncomfortable. No one was speaking to him. And I put myself in his position. If I was sitting at the table with just all white persons, how would I have felt? And then I turned behind and I spoke to him, never realizing that he was one of the key speakers because I've never met him before. And he was a prominent doctor managing 4 hospitals in Manchester. But at the end, he located me and he said, "Thank you for acknowledging me." And for me, that is something that I would have wanted for myself. So each one of us here this evening can make a difference. You have to become uncomfortable to be comfortable. And as you look inward, then you're able to shape the community, your church around you. And I believe that as we move forward, we can give that radical love. I want to be loved just as I want to love others. But sometimes we go into a place where we are uncomfortable. And when you sit in that uncomfortability, then you know what it is to be comfortable from others' perspective as well. That's me.
Thank you very much. There's one last group here. Or is it 2? Were you 1 together?
Thank you very much. As we gathered in our group, we said each of us has a story to share, and each of us experienced and faced some sort of discrimination in this journey. So every story is unique and every story is important. The second thing, as we discussed, we thought was, as Andy mentioned, racism flourishes when privilege is tolerated. And therefore, to pick up that intolerance towards privilege, and we need a space for dissent. How do we nurture that space for dissent in our moving forward? And then we also spoke about prejudice, how people are prejudiced, and they already make an opinion before even you come to make a point. So as faith communities, it is important that we address prejudice as well. And finally, we also said how important it is for faith, all faiths, to have a public relevance. Unless we have a public relevance, faith becomes too narrow, and therefore we start constructing walls. But if it has to be radical love, it is about breaking down all kinds of walls that are built in the name of gender, color, caste, creed, and sexuality as well. So unless we break down all these walls, radical love is not seen as a practical thing. So that was what we have discussed, and I hope my sisters would agree when I said it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Let's give one another an applause for the thought that's gone on. This is just the tip of the iceberg, tiniest piece of what we've been talking about. I'm just going to glance at my program and see where we are in terms of time. I'd be amazed if we were on time. We're only 5 minutes behind time, actually, which I give each other another big clap because we've been working really hard. We are drawing, as I say, towards the end of the program, but the plan now is to invite Nirthya to come and introduce us to some Bollywood-style dancing. And I know she'll feel very bad if we don't participate. So just warning you about that.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. So I'm sure everyone here has seen a little bit of Bollywood dancing. I'm sure you have. So it's basically just dancing which comes, yes, there you are. We've got some action going on here. But it started us off with influences. It's not just one particular style of dance. You've got influences from classical, semi-classical, folk, hip-hop, belly dancing. It's got everything. So I'm just going to go a little display of it first, and then we'll run through moves. I think you've all been sitting down for too long. You need to get up and move, I think. So I'll show you how it's done first, and you're all going to do it with me after. Yay.
चुम चुम के तुले याद मैनू गोल्डन झुमके मैं कन्ना विच पावा चुम चुम के तुले याद मैनू गोल्डन झुमके मैं कन्ना विच पावा चुम चुम के मन जावे शॉपिंग करा दे मन जावे रोमांटिक पिक्चर दिखा दे रिक्वेस्टा पाइया वे चिट्टियां कलाइयां वे ओ बेबी मेरी चिट्टियां कलाइयां वे चिट्टियां कलाइयां वे ओ बेबी मेरी वाइट कलाइयां वे चिट्टियां कलाइयां वे ओ बेबी मेरे तेरे हिस्से आइयां वे चिट्टियां कलाइयां वे ओ बेबी मेरी चिट्टियां कलाइयां वे पूनम की चांद को घूंघट के नीचे छुपा के लाई तेरे लिए दुनिया से नजरें चुरा के
पीछे कुआं आगे मेरे खाई तू ही बता जाऊं मैं कहाँ मुझको दुआ किसकी लगी भाई आके पधारा हूँ जो यहाँ
इल्ले फिकर आजा इधर बीट पे लगा ले तू ठुमका
1 2 3 4 get on the dance floor 1 2 3 4 get on the dance floor shake the booty shake the top and go hard shoulder hit the party hit the give me give me give me give me give me give me some more 1 2 3 4 get on the dance floor shake the top and go hard shoulder hit the party hit the give me give me give me give me give me give me some more
तू घंटी बिग बैन दी पूरा लंदन ठुमकदा ओ जदों नचे भैन दी पूरा लंदन ठुमकदा तू घंटी बिग बैन दी पूरा लंदन ठुमकदा ओ जदों नचे भैन दी पूरा लंदन ठुमकदा सिर ते गिलासी रख पंजाबी स्टाइल विच लस्सी दा गिलास खिच
Thank you. Two very short
role of faith communities in tackling racism. I just want to respond just briefly to some of those points and to add in some of the work that I've been doing in relation to faith, racism and health. And I'm not going to take too much time, I'm going to give most of the time to Don on this. But I want to pay tribute to Clarkson and the campaign in 1787 to abolish slavery worldwide. I also want to remember the likes of Aluda Equiano around the same time, who was a black slave that made significant contributions to the abolition movement. So I just want to remember the likes of him as well. Slavery is the most explicit act of racism in global history, and its enactment continues to have consequences that have now lasted over half a millennium. Andy, you have so articulately highlighted Clarkson's question about the removal of people from their homes through slavery and how this was recognised as a violation of humanity and one that goes against the Christian ethos and values. That Christian quote you give, which talks about doing unto others as you would have done unto you, is said as so fundamental to the Christian values, but yet in the spirit of religion, these barbaric acts of slavery were practiced over a significant period of time, and to this day, where people are still suffering the impacts of slavery. The roots of racism stem from different religions, the mission to Christianise and the global acceptability of owning those who are different. It was acceptable for people to own and dehumanise others despite their Christian preaching. Slavery was about owning, taking over and abusing people's bodies for human profit. And when Andy refers in his paper to leading by example, this clearly was not done during this slavery period. I just want to say, just not so long ago, just a few weeks ago, I was privileged to go to Ghana, and I went to a place called Elimina Castle, and I don't know if anybody's heard of it in Ghana. So it was a former hub of a slave trade in Ghana. And I walked into this castle, this ruined castle, still very much, the rooms were kind of like intact. Absolutely horrific what I saw. And the thing that really, really got me is there was a room where white people that had done wrong were placed into this room, and it was on the outside of the castle, so there was like a window, you could breathe. And those people were kept in captive there for some time. But next door to that, which was in, there was a room where black people were held, and there was no window. People were held in this space. They couldn't breathe, they were there to die, and one by one, these people were removed from this space. And these people died, and the man pointed out to the scratchings on the wall. There was all these scratchings of the people trying to get out on the wall. You could actually see them. It was absolutely awful. And then we saw, the rooms where women were taken, where women were selected, overlooking from the white masses at the top, looking down to select women to have sex with, and many of them had babies in those most inhumane conditions. So I kind of left there, and I was quite, really, really moved by it, but as I say, really humbled to have seen and witnessed where my brothers and sisters were actually held there in those circumstances. So institutional religion was and is an important identity source for black people in general, even though it was not for Du Bois himself. I make lots of reference to W.E.B. Du Bois. He was a sociologist who studied black American life and an activist who was one of the most important black protest leaders in the United States during the first half of the 20th century. And he clearly experienced racial discrimination and abuse based on his colour, but he formed a social identity that wasn't based on religion, but it was based on race. However, as Andy points out again, Du Bois talks about how religious institutions gave comfort, social cohesion, and a collective identity of their own to black people, who were still, and centuries later, an oppressed minority. The notion of whiteness, as defined by the colonists, can only be meaningful through the construction of blackness. So if we don't have blackness, we don't have whiteness. So, it's the basis for white privilege. And that was afforded to white people who were actually seen as being given a psychological wage for being white, whereas black people were taxed for being black. And I look at this in terms of health, and I can see how, that black racial tax really impacts upon people's health today. And also, Andy makes reference to, the teachings about supremacy and domination, which goes against all that is good, and on quotes, flourish where privilege is tolerated. He also highlights how Christian slaveholders were taught that dark-skinned people of Ham were to be cursed and substandard, how inhumane this could be, interpreted as such to justify slavery and ill treatment of others. There's a real significance of race, religion, and in the black church, and Dubois identifies the Black Negro Church as representing a freedom that black people could call their own and one that survived slavery. So I'm going to skip a few because I've actually taken a lot longer than I thought I was going to take. So I'm going to skip some of what I was going to say. And I just want to make reference to the impact that race has on health of black people. So as I said, I make a lot of reference to Dubois. I also make reference to Frank Fanon as well, and the construction of race and the legacy of slavery itself, and how he talks about the chronic impacts of inferiorization that is evidenced in those deep-rooted effects of slavery and the trauma that that causes to people. And I talk about this interaction of genes with the environment and nature and how it can produce more ill health and disease, causing epigenetic effects to the health of those affected. And I look at things like stress, those chronic stressors, that can be transmitted from the mother to the fetus during the prenatal period. And some of the evidence has gone beyond that to identify the long-term and intergenerational trauma of stress resulting from slavery. And so how can we justify this? When we look at some of the data that's out there, and it was just until December 2020, where black women were 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy. They say, oh, it's 4 times now, 4 times more likely now. It's just under 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy or as a result of their pregnancies. But also that black women are 40% more likely to have a miscarriage. This is no coincidence. If you think back to the impact of slavery, we can see how these things happen. We can see the profound impact on physical and mental health, lower life expectancy, higher blood pressure, higher, supposedly, threshold to pain. A lot of this goes back to as well. Andy's asked us to kind of almost prick our consciousness about how we see ourselves in the church. And when I look back and read about how black people were accepted or not accepted in the churches when they came over, in large numbers through Windrush, where are the Christian principles and Christian values in those kind of questions? So, as I said, I'm not going to go on for any much longer than that, but just really to say that race, religion, and racism, and I've done so much challenging around this, challenged the likes of Michael Marmot and people to say we need to get racism on there in terms of its impact upon health. The Black Church is an absolutely amazing forum in which to disseminate health messages, but there are also issues as well that we do need to grapple with within the church. So I'm just going to end there, but I can't give you more on the health disparities, but hopefully we can have a discussion at some point, in the future about some of the real impacts of health on our communities. But thank you for listening.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Faye, for that response. Such an important topic. So as David already said, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Manchester. Firstly, let me say a word of thanks to Dr. Andrew Boachi for such an insightful and important paper that he's given us today. Dr. Boakye has touched on many themes that are crucial for us to take away and move forward with in the work of racial justice. And I'm very grateful to be given the opportunity to respond to such a paper in this momentous occasion of the first Clarkson Day here at the Cathedral. The task of my research is to critically evaluate the public theology of Manchester Cathedral. And I've been doing this project for about 2 years now, and it's an honour today for me to present for the first time in many ways some of my thinking as it's been formed in the last 2 years in working with the Cathedral. As a disclaimer, the Cathedral team may not agree with everything I'm going to say today, but this is my interpretation of this place as I've been reading and thinking the last couple of years. So that's my little disclaimer. So in response to Dr. Boakye's paper, I'd like to pick up on the 3 challenges that he set forth and how I see them intersecting with the Cathedral's work, which will hopefully provide insights for us all today. And I hope for those of you who are not part of the Christian faith, you'll be able to make connections to your own faith traditions and communities as we think together about the fight against racial injustice. So firstly, Dr. Boakye has highlighted that religious institutions need to engage in honest self-critique and be honest in the appraisal of our own religious and spiritual spaces, owning up to our deficiencies when voices from the margins cry out for justice. This year, Father Jerome Robinson Brown published a book called Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer, The Church and the Famine of Grace, which I highly recommend to everybody. In the book, Robinson Brown highlights that one of the areas of intersectionality between racism and the exclusion of LGBTQ plus people is found in the institutional church's tendency to interpret, categorize, and subsequently treat differently groups within the community. Robinson Brown writes this, quote, "The church proclaims God's love for all while simultaneously practicing a form of drip-down graceonomics, dividing God's children between those who can immediately bask in the joy of God's love and those who must change and transform beyond all recognition before the love of God can truly be theirs. We are divided as the deserving and the undeserving, the pure and the impure, the good and the bad, and the well-behaved and the naughty, the saint and the sinner, both frequently and shamelessly." End quote. This tendency to divide and distinguish between individuals characterized by certain shared characteristics is at the heart of both racism and LGBTQ plus exclusion in the church and beyond. Therefore, as part of our honest self-reflection, we must not only critique our actions, which bring so much suffering and exclusion, but we need to even revise our doctrines, narratives, traditions, and practices, which have made these actions not only possible, but intelligible for the church to commit. Such theological revision is the work of repentance. And I believe that part of that repentance to take place, we must place those voices that are so often marginalized and excluded, people of color, women, and members of the LGBTQ plus community, as the most dominant voices in that discussion. It's not enough to be inclusive without significant transformation taking place to the centers of power. Because as the womanist philosopher Emily Towns reminds us, inclusion does not guarantee justice. From my study of the Cathedral, it seems to me that the Cathedral recognizes the harm that white, heteronormative, patriarchal theology has caused historically to those outside the centers of power. As a result, the Cathedral focuses on activity which resists the effects of this theology, but I wonder if more needs to be done to revise and articulate an alternative theological teaching in the recognition that the institutional church's historical and present failure is also a failure of its theology. Our God talk isn't good enough. The theological teachings of the church have often not been good news for those who find themselves outside of the white, patriarchal, and heteronormative framework that these teachings uphold. So the question for the Cathedral and the other religious institutions represented here is how can we deconstruct and rebuild our teachings in a way that they are good news for the marginalized? And this leads us nicely to the second point of Dr. Boakye's paper, where he's urged us to resist the temptation to depoliticize the gospel. Dr. Boakye has shown that engagement with social movements such as Black Lives Matter does not distract from the gospel and the mission of the church, but embodies it. And I think part of the problem with sentiments such as keep politics out of church is that we don't recognize that our religions are political and that such a statement in itself is political and not just religious. Often we reduce politics to simply statecraft, i.e. what the government does and what I can do to affect the government, such as voting. But actually politics is much broader because it's about the everydayness of our lives as we make decisions about our place and other people's places within it. So both politics and religion are about helping us understand who we are, who others are, what the world is about, and how we should act accordingly. The theologian Stanley Hauerwas has this mantra that I've taken for myself. It says, you can only act in the world that you can see, but you can only see by learning to say. What he's getting at with this statement is that the way we experience the world is formed by the way we learn to speak about the world. And the way that we learn to speak about the world is given to us by language in our culture and the traditions that we are formed within. So when we attend a choral evensong or attend a service at the local synagogue, gurdwara, mosque, or other places of worship, we can ask of ourselves, how is this practice and how are these words forming me to act within the world? How is it shaping my sight and understanding of the world and those around me? Let me just give you a little parable just to illustrate this. There's two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. And the older fish nods at the two young fish and says, how's the water, boys? The two young fish carry on swimming. And one turns to the other and says, what is water? Now, you may be wondering at this point, what does this have to do with racial justice? Well, the question is, what is the water that we are swimming in? Often, for those of us who identify as white, we don't see how our world is racially constructed. We're blind to it. And we need to ask ourselves, what is the water? And I think that one of the major ways that we can attend to this task of seeing how our world is racially constructed is, again, to enter into deep relationships with those who are marginalized. Because the reason they're marginalized is because they don't fit with a particular imagined vision of how the world is supposed to be. Again, this is a space where racism and LGBTQ exclusion intersect, because both are dependent on particular people being excluded because they don't fit within a culturally imagined norm. So thirdly and finally, Dr. Boakye has shown us that we must embrace radical love. I find love to be a difficult concept from my experience because many religious individuals that I encounter have such a wide understanding of what love is that even the most harmful and exclusionary practices can be labeled as loving. We've probably all experienced at some point in our lives someone saying, I am doing or saying this because I love you, as the person then proceeds to do or say something that does not conform to any reasonable definition of love. In regards to the topic of racism that we're discussing today, we all heard the responses to the chants of Black Lives Matter. We all heard somebody somewhere say, whether in person or online, well, I believe that all lives matter. Thus, when I hear Dr. Boakye saying we must embrace radical love, I can hear a hypothetical opponent responding, probably on Facebook or Twitter, well, yes, but we should love everybody equally. So we need to ask the question, what is love? Manchester Cathedral, I think, sets an example, and as it desires to demonstrate and embody an inclusiveness and love that seeks to empower those who lack power and bring people in who've previously been marginalised. In a multitude of ways, the cathedral, clergy, chapter and volunteers don't seek the comfort of the status quo, but continually try to break down walls and build bridges. It asks, who is missing and why are they missing? I think that Manchester Cathedral is such a place where the marginalised are brought in and can increasingly be a space and model for all of us as we move forward. So finally, let me just say, if we're to work according to what we've heard today, all the challenges, I think the road ahead is going to be long and difficult, just as it always has been. There will be those inside our communities and outside who are resistant to the work of liberation. But may we who are called to fight for such things be reminded of Dr. Boakye's words today. If Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, and Thomas Clarkson chose comfort over radical love, our world would be a deeply impoverished place. Thank you.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Dominic, for your responses. We've come to the end of our day, and we're going to invite Dean Rogers to lead us in a very, very simple act of commitment.
Before I do that, can I just say how good the day's been? It's been a stretching day, I hope, a day of challenge, a day of thoughtfulness, reflection, but most importantly, action is needed. Somebody said very recently, we just spend too much time with words. Now, theologians and clergy of all sorts love words, but we must make sure that words are followed by transformational action. We want to see less stroke no racism in our midst, in our communities, in our faith communities, in our streets and in our institutions. We want every person, black, white, green or blue, or even if you have gray hair like Stephen, to be treated fairly, equally as God's beloved children. Can I say thank you to David for all of his work in pulling this day together? To thank you, David. Can we give David a round of applause? Bollywood comes to Manchester. Nithya, thank you so much. It's been marvelous to have you participate. All of our stall holders, many of them have gone home. One is poised to leave the cathedral as soon as we do the act of commitment. Thank you, Elizabeth, and all of the others who've had stalls here, sharing your work. To those, yes, indeed, thank you. We've never had these sort of events sort of filmed like we have had today. Thank you, Khan, Charles, and the film crew. It's going to be on BBC News tonight, so watch the 6 o'clock news when you go home. Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. To Bev Hughes, who spoke during the day, to Addie, who spoke to us about the church's general slow tortoise-like movement on racism. Thank you, Addie, for speaking to us about the task group report. Thank you also, Faye and Dom, for your responses. How can we not end the day by saying thank you to our keynote speaker, Andy? Your talk was absolutely inspirational. And it's great that we have you in our city, and we must make more use of you in a positive way to inspire us, to lead us forward, because we need brothers and sisters like you. So thank you, Andy, for all that you've shared with us. And thank you to each and every one of you for coming. I forgot to mention, we said thank you to those who provided our food at lunchtime. Thank you again for that. And yes, let's give them a round of applause. And lastly, thank you one and all. As Desmond Tutu would say, clap yourself for coming today. A little simple, would you like to stand as we say these very simple words? I know they are words, but let's say them deeply and meaningfully as we commit ourselves. We commit ourselves to challenging all forms of racism in Greater Manchester as we work together for justice, equality, and inclusion for all. Thank you very much. Have a safe trip home, everybody. It's been lovely to see folks I've not seen for a while here today. Robin, lovely to see you, and many others. Thank you very much for being here in person today. Take care, everybody.